In my early 20s, I worked as a ranger in a remote national forest. It was the perfect job for me back then. I loved the outdoors, every day brought a new challenge, and best of all, I worked alone. On days I finished early, I would find a scenic spot to read or listen to music. It was my therapy. I had come off a brutal year of university and a painful breakup. I needed the solitude, and the park provided it. While the days were serene, the nights were a different story. You know how the dark feels heavy even in your own home? Multiply that by 1,000 when you're in the middle of a vast, unlit wilderness. The worst spot to be during a night shift was the Sentinel, a fire lookout tower on the northern ridge. The Sentinel was massive, standing over 100 feet tall, built from weathered cedar that still smelled of sap. It was essentially a cabin on stilts. Inside, it wasn't exactly luxurious: 2 chairs, a desk, a flickering bulb, and a small fan. I always brought books to keep my mind off the suffocating silence of the night. The climb up took 10 minutes. By the time you reached the top, the forest below had vanished into an abyss. My job was simple: spot fires. If the moon was full, I could see for miles. On moonless nights, however, the world simply ceased to exist beyond the reach of my lamp. Parks, despite their reputation, are often magnets for the desperate. We had escaped convicts, poachers, and transients. I'd seen it all, but I had never encountered anything truly threatening until the end of that summer. Near the park, there was a high-security prison. We rarely talked about it, but it was always there in the back of our minds. That night, a woman in her late 30s stumbled into our station. She looked rattled. I think I was being stalked," she whispered. She explained she had been hiking the Juniper Loop when she saw someone hiding behind the trees. They weren't camping, she said, her voice trembling. They looked like they were avoiding the sunlight, and they kept making these whistling noises like a wood thrush. The manager, Marcus Weig, tried to calm her down, but her fear was palpable. After she left, the mood in the station turned cold. Marcus sent 2 of our best trackers out to the trail, but they returned hours later having found nothing. No tracks, nothing. "Just a case of nerves," Marcus said, trying to smile. "Go to the Sentinel. It's the safest place in the forest." I climbed the tower as the sun dipped below the horizon. The tower creaked in the rising wind. When I reached the base, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Someone had carved a pair of eyes into the cedar wood near the entrance. I brushed it off as a prank, but my heart wasn't convinced. An hour into my shift, the radio crackled. It was Marcus doing his rounds. "See any Wendigos up there?" he joked. "Very funny," I replied. "If you hear any birds whistling, run." Then I heard it. Creak. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a board shifting under a heavy foot. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed the radio, but only static met my pleas. Someone was on the stairs, and I had to know. I crept to the door and flung it open. Empty. I walked out onto the catwalk and shone my flashlight down the stairs. That's when I saw it. A piece of reflective fabric caught on the railing. And beneath it, another pair of eyes had been freshly carved into the wood. I realized then they were playing with me. I wasn't just being stalked. I was being hunted. I heard the sound of scraping above me on the roof. I turned to flee, but a familiar whistling sound echoed from the stairs below. They were flanking me, one above, one below. I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed over the railing, dangling by my fingers in the pitch blackness of a brewing thunderstorm. I heard them pass right by me, their footsteps slow and methodical. When I felt them move toward the lower levels, I scrambled back up, burst into the cabin, and barricaded the door. They slammed against the wood. Thump, thump, I was trapped. I huddled in the corner, clutching a heavy iron lamp. Then the storm broke. A blinding flash of lightning turned the night into day, followed by a crack of thunder that felt like the earth splitting open. A surge of electricity arced through the metal frame of the tower. When I opened my eyes, the air smelled of ozone and charred wood. The lightning had struck the tower. Outside, 2 figures lay sprawled on the ground, silenced by the strike. Marcus and the others arrived minutes later to find the Sentinel engulfed in flames. The men were identified as escaped prisoners who had been hiding in the woods for days. They hadn't come for the view. They had come for me. I never worked as a ranger again. Sometimes when I look at the small piece of charred cedar I kept as a souvenir, I don't see the terror. I remember that while I was being hunted, the forest, the wild, indifferent, and powerful nature was also watching. And that night it decided to intervene. Story 2. I have been a ranger at Blackwood Reserve for over a decade. The reserve is a vast, rugged expanse of 5,000 acres, known for its dense ancient hardwood forests and a central feature that most locals avoid, the ruins of Blackwood Manor. It was a sprawling stone estate that burned to the ground in a mysterious tragedy in the 1920s. Today, only the blackened foundation and a few crumbling arches remain, standing like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. My patrol vehicle is a rugged off-road motorcycle. It allows me to cover the treacherous terrain quickly, weaving through the overgrown bridle paths that horse patrols simply cannot manage. Most of my nights are quiet, filled only with the hum of the engine and the rustle of nocturnal wildlife. But some nights the woods seem to breathe with a different, heavier atmosphere. It was a Tuesday, the air unusually thick and smelling of ozone and damp, rotted earth. I was performing a sweep near the northern perimeter, a sector I usually avoid after sundown. As I neared the foundation of the manor, I saw a flicker of light emanating from the center of the ruins. I assumed it was kids, maybe a group of thrill-seekers with high-powered LED flashlights. I killed the engine and approached on foot, my boots crunching softly on the skeletal remains of dead leaves. I kept my hand on my radio, intending to call for backup before announcing my presence. However, as I drew closer, the silence hit me. It wasn't the natural silence of a sleeping forest. It was an absolute suffocating void. No crickets, no distant owl calls, not even the wind dared to rustle the canopy above. I rounded the corner of a standing stone archway and froze. There were no teenagers. In the center of the charred stone floor, a lone man sat in a cross-legged position. He was surrounded by dozens of old rusted pocket watches, all laid out in a perfect pulsating circle. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the air in front of him, his lips moving in a rhythmic, silent chant. "Sir," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. I aimed my flashlight beam directly at him. "This is private property. You are trespassing. You need to pack your things and leave immediately." He didn't turn. Instead, he spoke, his voice sounding like grinding stone, echoing as if it were coming from the ground beneath us rather than his throat. "They are ticking again. Can you hear them? The seconds are leaking out of the walls." I stepped closer, ready to grab his shoulder, and that was when I noticed the shadows. They weren't behaving like shadows cast by moonlight. They were stretching, detaching themselves from the stone walls, growing in depth and texture. They had no faces, but they had eyes, not red, not animalistic, but a dull, metallic, and reflective silver. They were shifting, elongated shapes that seemed to bleed into the trees surrounding the ruins. My flashlight beam swept across the ground, and I saw the watches. Every single one of them had its hands spinning backward rapidly, creating a faint, frantic whirring sound that began to sync with the pounding in my own ears. "They aren't just shadows," the man whispered, finally turning to look at me. His own eyes had turned that same dull, piercing silver hue. "They are the ones who were left behind when the manor fell. They have been waiting for someone to unlock the time, and you, Ranger, have finally arrived." A jolt of pure, primal terror surged through me. I didn't wait for him to finish. I turned and sprinted back toward my motorcycle. Behind me, the sound of the watches shattered into a cacophony of breaking glass and clockwork gears grinding against stone. I vaulted onto my bike and kicked the ignition. As I sped away, I risked a look in my rearview mirror. The ruins were no longer dark. They were glowing with a pale, sickening silver light, and the man was gone. There was only a flat, empty field of grass where the manor had stood for a century. The stone walls, the arches, and the foundation had simply vanished into thin air. I reported a hallucination caused by a suspected localized gas leak at the site to my supervisor. He bought the story, likely because he didn't want the paperwork of a formal investigation. But I never go near that part of the reserve anymore. Sometimes when the wind blows from the north, I can still hear it. The faint rhythmic sound of 1,000 watches ticking in unison, counting down to something I know I should never witness again. Cab Story 3. I have worked as a ranger for 12 years, mostly in the expansive Sector 4 of the reserve, a region so rugged and isolated that it is often referred to by the staff as the Dead Zone. It's a vast stretch of old-growth forest, box canyons, and hidden sinkholes. Unlike the main park, there are no trails here, no maps, and no cell service. My job in Sector 4 is simple: monitor the perimeter sensors and ensure that no one wanders into the treacherous limestone caves that dot the terrain. The trouble started on a Tuesday in late October. The air felt static charged, like the moments before a massive lightning storm, yet the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. My patrol was routine until I reached the echo chamber, a natural stone amphitheater where the acoustics are so perfect you can hear a leaf fall 100 yards away. When I arrived, I heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was the sound of a mechanical ticking, consistent and rhythmic coming from deep within the rocks. But it was rhythmic in a way that felt wrong. It had a stutter, like a heartbeat struggling to keep time. I scanned the perimeter and found something that made me freeze. In the middle of a clearing, there was a perfect circle of white, powdery ash, about 10 feet in diameter. In the exact center stood my own canteen, the one I had left in my truck 4 miles back. I walked toward it, my hand instinctively dropping to my sidearm. I reached down to touch the canteen, but as my fingers grazed the cold metal, a voice echoed through the amphitheater. It was my own voice, clear as crystal, reciting the exact conversation I had with my supervisor that morning. "The sensor in Sector 4 is down again, Chief. I'll head out and check it." Then the voice shifted. It wasn't me anymore. It was a distorted, layered version of my own voice laughing. The sound seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, the forest around me began to change. The trees weren't moving, but their bark was shifting. The familiar rough texture of the pine and oak began to smooth out, turning into a pale, translucent surface like frosted glass. I could see shapes moving inside the trunks of the trees, dark, elongated silhouettes pacing back and forth, trapped behind the organic glass. I backed away, but the ground beneath me felt soft, like walking on sponge. I realized with a jolt of horror that the grass I was stepping on wasn't vegetation. It was millions of tiny hair-like fibers all vibrating in unison. I turned to run, but the path back to my truck was gone. Instead, the canyon walls had rearranged themselves into a maze of obsidian mirrors. Everywhere I looked, I saw myself, not just one version, but hundreds. Some versions were older, some were younger, and some were wearing the uniforms of rangers who had vanished in this park 50 years ago. They were all standing in the mirrors watching me, their mouths sewn shut with thick black thread. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred, tearing through the glass-like trees. Every time I looked back, the forest seemed to reset itself, the geometry of the canyon shifting like a kaleidoscope. I wasn't in the park anymore. I was in a folded space, a pocket of reality that didn't obey the laws of physics. I don't know how long I ran. Time felt like a suggestion, not a constant. I eventually tripped over a jagged rock and tumbled into a ravine. When I hit the bottom, the world snapped back to normal. The trees were wood again. The grass was real. The canyon wall was just limestone. I crawled to my truck and drove until I reached the main station sobbing. My supervisor asked me what happened, but when I tried to speak, I couldn't remember the name of the sector. I couldn't remember the name of the canyon. It was as if my brain had been wiped clean of that specific coordinate. I still work as a ranger, but I requested a transfer to the southern gate. People ask me why I never go to the northern sectors anymore. I just tell them the terrain is too rough. But in the quiet of the night when I'm lying in bed, I hear it, that rhythmic stuttering heartbeat. And I know with a dread that never leaves me, that somewhere deep in Sector 4 there is a version of me still running through those mirrors, still trying to find the exit. Story 4. I have been a ranger at the Whispering Pines National Forest for 15 years. I know every ridge, every stream, and every hidden grotto in the High Divide. It is a place of immense beauty, but it is also a place that keeps secrets, secrets that don't want to be found. It was mid-November, the time of year when the forest becomes a graveyard of dead leaves and frozen mud. A brutal cold front had swept through, locking the landscape in a deep, bone-chilling frost. I was out alone, a standard procedure for a remote equipment check. One of our motion-activated trail cameras, located at the mouth of a box canyon known as Devil's Throat, had been sending back corrupted, glitchy data for weeks. As I neared the canyon, the atmosphere shifted. The forest, usually alive with the soft chatter of squirrels and the rustle of wind, went deathly silent. It was a vacuum of sound so absolute that the ringing in my own ears became the loudest thing in the world. I reached the site, and the first thing I noticed was the smell, not the crisp scent of pine and snow, but the cloying, sickly sweet stench of stagnant water and old meat. I examined the ground. The snow was a chaotic mess of prints. One moment, they were the heavy, splayed impressions of a large grizzly bear. The next, they shifted seamlessly into the distinct, treaded patterns of a military-grade combat boot. They led directly to the center of the clearing, where they simply stopped as if the entity had evaporated. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached for my radio, but the air was filled with a static so sharp it made my teeth ache. I was alone, miles from the nearest human, and someone or something was playing a very sophisticated game of cat and mouse. I checked the camera. It was shattered, the lens pulverized from the inside out. As I knelt to pick up the pieces, I heard a sound behind me. It was the soft, rhythmic clicking of a boot heel against rock. "Ranger?" The voice was mine. It wasn't an imitation. It was a perfect crystalline recording of my own voice, down to the slight rasp I'd developed from the cold. I spun around, my hand instinctively dropping to my holster. Standing 20 yards away, framed by the dark skeletal trunks of the pines, was a man. He was wearing my uniform, the exact model down to the sun-faded patches on the sleeves. His back was turned to me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Identify yourself!" The figure didn't jump. It didn't react with the startled grace of a human. Instead, it began to rotate its head. It turned with an agonizing, grinding friction, a series of wet pops and cracks echoing through the canyon. It turned past the shoulder, past the back, further than any human spine could allow until it faced me. It was my face. My eyes, my chin, my messy wind-blown hair. But the expression was wrong. The skin around the eyes was taut, stretched over the skull like wet parchment. And the pupils were not circular. They were horizontal. "Like a goat's, Ranger," it repeated, the word sounding like it was being chewed. Then the transformation began. It was not a magical shimmer, but a visceral, horrifying physical reality. The creature's jaw unhinged, dropping down toward its chest, and the skin of its face split open like an overripe fruit. From beneath the human mask, a mess of matted silver-gray fur erupted, accompanied by the wet tearing of muscle and bone being rearranged. It grew, shifting from a slender man into a hulking, hunched nightmare of elongated limbs and jagged claws. It began to stalk toward me, but it didn't walk. It skittered, its limbs moving in a jerky, stop-motion animation that defied the laws of anatomy. Every few steps, it would shift its form again. An arm would become a wing, a leg would turn into a deer's hoof, as if it were testing out new parts of its gruesome collection. I drew my sidearm and fired. The first shot hit its chest, but there was no blood. There was only the sound of a hollow thud, like hitting a drum filled with dry leaves. The creature didn't flinch. It merely let out a sound, a shrill, high-pitched whistle that morphed into a woman's shriek, then into the deep, guttural growl of a predator. I ran. I didn't try to fight. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass tearing through the brush, my uniform shredded by thorns. Behind me, the forest was alive with the sound of snapping branches and that rhythmic, mocking clicking. Every time I reached a clearing, I would hear my own voice calling out from different directions. "Help me. Over here. Ranger, don't leave me alone." It was using my own memories, my own calls for help, to lure me deeper into the trap. I reached the ridge as the sun began to set, the sky turning a bruised, violent purple. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I scrambled in, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice. As I pulled away, tires spinning on the frost-covered gravel, I looked into the side mirror. The creature was standing at the edge of the woods. It had shifted back into my form. It stood perfectly still, watching me leave. Then it raised a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate, mocking wave, and touched its own face, mimicking the way I had wiped the sweat from my brow earlier that day. I drove for 6 hours without stopping. I abandoned the job, my home, and that part of the country. I live in a city now surrounded by millions of people, bright lights, and the hum of traffic. But I am never truly alone. Sometimes, when the apartment building is quiet and the city goes silent at 3 a.m., I hear a soft tapping at my window. A rhythm, click, click, drag. And then a voice, my voice, whispering through the glass. "I'm still wearing your skin, Ranger." And it fits perfectly. I keep the curtains drawn. I never look out. Because I know that if I look, I won't just see the darkness, I'll see myself, waiting for me to finally open the door. Story 5, they told me the job was a sanctuary. 5 days on, 2 days off, the regional director had said with a welcoming smile. It's the best view in the state, Elias. Nothing to do but watch the canopy and enjoy the silence. I was 22, fresh out of a forestry program, eager to prove my independence. I didn't care about the isolation. In fact, I craved it. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the demands of people, and the crushing weight of academic expectations. I wanted to be a guardian of the wild. I arrived at Station 9 on a Tuesday. It was a brutal, monolithic structure of weathered steel and reinforced glass, perched atop the highest ridge in the Blackwood Reserve. The climb up the rusted spiral staircase took me nearly 15 minutes, my backpack heavy with supplies. By the time I reached the observation deck, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised purple shadows across a sea of pine that seemed to stretch into infinity. The first 2 nights were exactly as promised, serene and utterly empty. I read, I drank terrible coffee, and I radioed in my status reports. Then came the 3rd night. It started just after 3 a.m. A thick, suffocating fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest floor and swallowing the base of the tower. I was sitting at the control desk, nursing a mug of lukewarm tea, when a sound ripped through the silence. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the creak of the structure. It was the sound of heavy, rhythmic thuds like something massive walking through mud. Thump, thump, thump. I stood up, my heart doing a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I grabbed my high-powered spotlight and leaned against the glass, panning it across the fog-drenched canopy. At first, I saw nothing. But then, about 50 yards from the base of the tower, the light caught a shimmer, not of fur, but of something slick like wet, oiled skin. I focused the beam. My breath hitched, freezing in my lungs. Standing there was a nightmare of geometry. It stood on 2 legs, but they were disjointed, jointed backward like a grasshopper's, yet thick as the trunk of an ancient oak. Its torso was impossibly long, tapering into a thin, skeletal chest that seemed to vibrate. But the head, God, the head. It wasn't a head at all. It was a jagged vertical split in the upper torso, a maw lined with rows of translucent needle-like teeth that hummed with a low-frequency vibration I could feel in my own marrow. It was neither animal nor man. It was something that belonged in the deep, unlit history of the earth. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling so hard I dropped the spotlight. It clattered against the metal floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dead of the night. It heard me. The creature's torso snapped toward the tower. That vertical mouth opened wide and a sound emerged. Not a roar, but a perfect, distorted replication of a human laugh. It was a desperate, wet, gurgling laugh that sounded exactly like someone choking on their own blood. Then, it began to climb. It didn't use the stairs. It drove its long, hook-like fingers into the steel exterior of the tower, peeling back the thick metal as if it were parchment. I heard the screech of tortured iron as it hauled its massive bulk up the side of the station. I scrambled into the corner of the small cabin, pulling my desk and chair against the door. I knew it was useless. I was 100 feet in the air, trapped in a glass cage with a monster that was tearing the tower apart. I grabbed my radio. "Mayday, Mayday! This is Station 9. I have an intruder. I don't know what it is. It's climbing the tower. Send help, please." All I got back was static. A rhythmic, clicking static that sounded eerily like the clicking of the creature's teeth. For the next 4 hours, I lived in a state of primal paralysis. The creature circled the observation deck, its weight causing the entire tower to sway and groan. I could hear it tapping on the glass with those hooked fingers. Tap, 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 testing the strength of the panes. Every time it passed a window, I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. It moved with an intelligence that terrified me. It wasn't just a beast. It was hunting me, enjoying the fear, waiting for me to break. At one point, its face pressed against the glass right in front of me. I saw those horizontal pupils, those wet, oily scales, and the way the skin rippled around the vertical maw. It didn't strike. It just watched. It stayed there, unmoving, while the clock ticked toward dawn. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I barely blinked. I felt my hair turning white with the sheer, unadulterated terror of those hours. When the first rays of sunlight finally breached the horizon, the creature stopped. It emitted one last long vibrating shriek that shattered 3 of the window panes. Then it turned and leaped from the tower. I didn't see where it landed. I only heard a heavy thud, followed by the sound of something dragging itself rapidly into the dense, foggy woods. I didn't come down. I stayed huddled in that corner, clutching my radio, until I heard the distinct sound of a motor vehicle around 8 a.m. When I finally crawled to the window and saw the regional director's truck, I didn't even wait for him to call up. I left my gear, I left my bag, and I descended that staircase in a blind, sobbing rush. The director looked at me, at the shredded steel of the tower, at the broken glass, and at the hollowed-out, catatonic look in my eyes, and he didn't ask a single question. He just handed me my final check and drove me to the nearest town. I resigned before I even reached the main office. I never went back for my things. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't go into parks. I live in a house with blacked-out windows, and every night, when I hear a thump on the roof or a scrape against the siding, I don't look. I just sit in the dark, wondering if it followed me, wondering if that vertical maw is waiting for me to step outside just one more time. The wilderness isn't a sanctuary. It's a larder. And I was almost the meal. 3 years had passed since I abandoned the tower at Blackwood Reserve. I had relocated to a bustling coastal city, surrounded by the noise of traffic and the constant movement of people. I thought the chaos of civilization would be enough to drown out the memory of that night. I was wrong. It began with the dreams, not just nightmares, but persistent visceral visions. I would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of steel being peeled back like paper. Then the phone calls started. I'd answer, and there would be nothing but that rhythmic, stuttering static, the same static I had heard on my radio the night the creature climbed the tower, when I received a letter from the forestry department stating that Station 9 was scheduled for demolition due to structural instability caused by unexplained environmental damage. I knew I couldn't stay away. I was the only person who knew what had really happened. If they tore that tower down without sealing what was underneath, the nightmare might find a new way into the world. I returned to the reserve in the late autumn of the 3rd year. The forest felt different, more aggressive, as if it had been waiting for my return. The drive up the ridge was silent. My old supervisor, who had aged 10 years in 3, met me at the base. He didn't ask why I came back. He just handed me a key and a heavy-duty flashlight. "Finish it, Elias," he whispered. We couldn't. I climbed the spiral staircase, my legs shaking with every step. The steel was scarred, deep jagged gouges cut into the metal, perfectly matching the claw marks of that night. When I reached the top, the observation deck was exactly as I had left it. My discarded mug was still on the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust. But as I swept my light across the glass, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Etched into the inside of the glass were hundreds of tiny, fine lines. I stepped closer, squinting. They weren't scratches. They were tallies, 1, 2, 3, thousands of them. The creature hadn't just been hunting me that night. It had been documenting something. I looked down at the floor where the dust had been disturbed by something heavy. There was a trail of dark, oily residue leading not to the door but to a hidden floor hatch in the center of the cabin. A hatch that shouldn't have been there. I pried it open. It led to a narrow, vertical service shaft that dropped into the very heart of the mountain. I shone my light down into the dark, and what I saw made me gasp. The shaft wasn't a natural cave. It was a nest. The walls were lined with thousands of pieces of human clothing woven into a dense, protective tapestry. And at the bottom there was a rhythmic, pulsing light, the same bioluminescent shimmer I had seen in the creature's maw. I realized then that I wasn't the survivor of a random attack. I was the observer of an infestation. The creature hadn't killed me because it needed a witness. It needed someone to carry the memory of its existence back to the world of men, to spread the fear that acts as a beacon for more of its kind. As I stared into that abyss, a sound rose from the depths, a wet, guttural laugh. It was the same laugh from 3 years ago, but this time it was echoed by dozens of others. I didn't try to save the tower. I didn't try to fight. I doused the entire cabin in the accelerant I had brought in my pack and lit the match. The fire was instantaneous and violent. I barely made it down the stairs before the tower became a pillar of flame. I watched from the safety of my truck as the steel groaned and finally collapsed. But as the structure fell, I saw something move in the smoke, a dozen dark, slick shapes leaping from the inferno, vanishing into the deep, dark woods of the Blackwood Reserve. I left that day, knowing that the fire didn't end the nightmare, it only evicted it. I don't look at the woods anymore. I don't look at the shadows. And I never ever answer the phone when it rings after 3 a.m. Because somewhere, deep in the expanse of this world, the observers are still watching, waiting for the next witness to come to the ridge. I thought burning the tower would end it. I lived for months in a state of hypervigilance, my life reduced to locks, chains, and the hum of city lights. But the fear had changed. It was no longer just about survival, it was about containment. I knew those things were out there, and I knew that fire, steel, and distance were no longer enough to stop them. The end didn't come with a crash or a scream. It came with silence. One evening I returned to my apartment to find my front door standing wide open. Nothing was stolen. No furniture was tossed. But in the center of my living room floor, someone, or something, had placed a single, small, rusted pocket watch. It was identical to the ones I had seen in my nightmares. It wasn't ticking. I picked it up, and the moment my skin touched the metal, the world around me dissolved. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing back on that ridge, but there was no tower. There was no fire. The air was cold, smelling of pine and ozone, just like that first night. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer mine. They were thin, pale, and covered in that same slick, oily film I had seen on the creature's skin. I walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down. Below me, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a man. He was dressed in a ranger's uniform. A uniform that looked faded and worn, as if he had been walking the woods for 100 years. He was holding a high-powered flashlight, scanning the canopy, looking for something that wasn't there. I realized with a clarity that shattered my soul that the man below was me. The loop was complete. I wasn't just the witness. I was the next stage of the infestation. The creature hadn't let me go to spread fear. It had let me go so that I would eventually evolve into the very thing that would replace the next ranger who dared to watch the woods. The man below paused. He shone his light toward the ridge, toward me. "Is someone there?" he called out. His voice was fresh, hopeful, and blissfully unaware of the horror that awaited him. I opened my mouth to scream, to warn him, but no human sound came out. Instead, a low, rhythmic, distorted sound emerged. A sound that was a perfect replication of a human laugh, wet and choking. I felt my jaw unhinge, and the vertical maw in my chest began to hum with that low-frequency vibration. I didn't want to descend, but my body was no longer my own. It belonged to the forest now. It belonged to the hunger. I leaped from the ridge, landing silently in the mist. I skittered through the trees, moving with an intelligence that wasn't mine, stalking the man who was once me. I am the watcher now. I am the silence in the woods. I am the reason you don't look out the window when you hear a thump on the roof. If you ever go to a national park, if you ever feel that sudden, inexplicable silence, and if you ever hear your own voice calling to you from the deep, dark pines, do not look, do not answer, and for the love of God, do not go up to the tower, because the forest always keeps its own, and it is always hungry for someone new to take the watch. Story 6. It was one of those nights when the Chainati Desert breathes its suppressed rage. It wasn't just wind. It was whips of scorching sand, heavy with quartz grains that clawed at the car's paint and whistled insanely around the windows. I thought I had grown accustomed to the isolation of the border, to that unforgiving land where distances stretch until you feel like the last human on the face of the earth. But that night the desert had a different law. My patrol stopped near a rugged rocky slope after shifting sands completely blocked the road. I stepped out of Unit 12, and the first thing I faced was the void. I saw nothing but pitch-black darkness pierced by dust motes that blinded the eyes. I tried to walk. Every step in that sand felt like a struggle against an invisible beast. The sand sank beneath my feet, and the wind pushed me back with such force that my shoulder bones groaned. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of ancient metals and death that hadn't been buried well. As I felt my way using my flashlight, the beam fell upon something that did not belong to the desert environment. At first I thought it was a dead yucca tree, but trees do not stand on two slender legs like rusted light poles. I stopped, my heart hammering against my chest like a desperate attempt to escape my ribcage. It was there, the Slender Man. It had no face, just a smooth surface like white limestone, yet I felt its gaze penetrating me, not as a human, but as something reading my life's file, all my fears, all my regrets. Its height defied logic. Its limbs were terrifyingly long, stretched out like the branches of a dead tree, twisting in the wind without shaking, unlike its stationary body. It stood atop a sand dune, and it seemed as if the wind itself bent around it, as if afraid to approach this embodied void. I tried to retreat, but the ground beneath me seemed to lose its stability. The sand was no longer sand. It felt like arms pulling me down. I heard the sound of dry wood rubbing together, as if its limbs were moving to tear the silence apart. The Slender Man didn't walk. It faded and suddenly appeared closer. Its movement wasn't physical. It was a series of leaps through the fabric of reality itself. The desert that had been storming around me suddenly fell silent. I no longer heard the wind. I no longer heard my own breathing. There was only noise in my head, a sharp, unbearable ringing. I looked at my hands. They were shaking, and I lost the ability to hold the flashlight, which fell into the sand. The scene began to distort. The dust filling the air started taking shapes. Human heads, severed limbs, memories from a past I had tried to forget. The monster was feeding on my distraction. The Slender Man didn't want to kill me. It wanted to assimilate me into its parallel world, into that gray zone where time stops. I gathered the remains of my resilience. I remembered my old partner's words about the cruelty of nature. The desert does not like weakness. I pulled my utility knife from my belt and began to till the sand vigorously. Not like one fighting, but like one digging his own grave. I plunged my hand into the cold sand beneath the hot surface layer and pulled out a handful of earth rich in the minerals and salts that gather in our harsh valleys. I screamed, not for help, but to challenge the silence it had imposed on me. I threw the salt and sand at it not as a superstition, but as a declaration of my presence in its space. It didn't disappear, but it shimmered. For a brief moment, its body looked like a glitchy image on a broken screen. I seized that second. I turned and ran, caring for nothing. The sand tore at my skin and the wind slapped my face as if warning me, but I didn't stop. I returned to the car, jumped inside and slammed the steel doors shut. I sat in the dark inside Unit 12, hearing the monster's long claws tapping on the car roof very slowly, rhythmic, funerary taps. It didn't open the doors. It didn't break the glass. It merely waited, leaving me to face my dread inside that metal box, surrounded by unforgiving sand and wind carrying the cries of the dead. Until dawn, I knew I wasn't alone and that the Slender Man hadn't gone far. It was just waiting in the distance, in that vast expanse of sand that possesses no memory and no mercy, which had now become my eternal prison. With sunrise, the light did not bring the salvation I had hoped for. In the Texas desert, morning only means you have become a clearer target for the heat and the fear. I opened my eyes slowly, my back aching from hunching over the driver's seat. I looked at the car roof. There were long, deep scratches in the metal, as if something had tried to pierce the steel with fingers like rusted ship nails. I looked outside. The sand had piled up around the tires due to the night winds, as if trying to bury us together. I got out of the car. The air was eerily still. No sound of birds, no rustling of snakes, only the silence that precedes a storm. I walked a few steps away from Unit 12, looking for any trace, any proof that what happened was just a hallucination due to exhaustion. But at the base of the dune where the entity had stood, I found something that made my heart stop. There were no human footprints. Instead, the ground at that point was dug deep, as if something very heavy had been standing there. And beside the pit, the desert sand had turned a dark black, smelling of ozone and burnt flesh. I keyed the radio to call for support, but the voice that came out wasn't Ashland's from the station. It was my own voice. A recording echoed from the night before. The desert demands an ancient debt. The desert has no mercy. I realized then that I wasn't just being hunted on the outside. I had become part of this entity's playground. I looked back, and in the shimmer of the mirage caused by the rising sun, I saw it again. It was standing hundreds of meters away, so tall it seemed to bridge the earth and the sky. It didn't move, but it leaned its body toward the north where the ruins of the abandoned shafter mines lay. It was a silent message. Follow me. My survival instinct ordered me to get in the car and flee toward the station at full speed, but my mind was blank, pulled by an invisible thread toward that mine. I began to walk. I walked for hours amidst scorching sand that stung the soles of my feet even through my military boots. The desert grew harsher. Sharp rocky ridges cut my legs and the wind began to return, but this time it carried voices. The voices of thousands who had lost their way here, whispering my name, begging me to stop, to surrender to sleep in the shadows of the rocks. When I reached the entrance to the shafter mine, the sun was beginning to set. The mine entrance was a black hole in the heart of the mountain, like the mouth of a beast waiting for its prey. I entered. There was no light, only dense darkness with the smell of dust mixed with the scent of ancient death. Inside, there was no more wind, no more desert. There was something else. On the mine walls, I found hundreds of images carved into the rock. Images of me sleeping in my car, reading reports, shivering with fear. At the end of the tunnel, I saw it sitting. The slender man was wrapping its long limbs around itself, sitting before a pile of objects, watches, ID cards of agents missing for decades, and shattered radios. It turned slowly, and without its smooth face, I felt the cold of ice touch my soul. There was no more sound, no more words. Just an overwhelming feeling that my time was up and the desert had finally collected its debt. I drew my weapon, not to fight it, but to protect the last part of my sanity. But before I could pull the trigger, the wall behind it vanished, and I found myself standing before the station entrance. At the exact moment I had left my shift the day before, I walked into the office and everyone stared at me in shock. Alejandro, where were you? We've lost contact with you for 24 hours. I looked at my watch. It was stopped. I looked at my clothes. They were filled with black sand that doesn't exist in any part of this desert. I wiped my face with my hand and felt something stuck in my hair. I pulled it out slowly. It was a small white owl feather, tied with a red thread, still warm as if just plucked from a living body. I realized then that I hadn't returned from the mine, but rather, I had left a part of myself there, and the entity now possessed the key to my return whenever it wished. Since then, I never close my eyes. I know that the Slender Man is still waiting somewhere behind the horizon, counting the hours until I return to be completed in its collection. A full month of eerie silence passed. Everyone at the station started to forget my strange stories, and I began to believe myself that I had actually won. But the desert in Marfa doesn't give you peace except to lure you into a deeper trap. Last Tuesday, it was my turn at the old observation tower on the northern edge. The wind had completely died down, something that hadn't happened in decades. A stillness that made my ears ring from the intensity of the silence. While I was reviewing the movement logs, I noticed movement on security camera number 4. The camera was pointed towards Skull Canyon, a restricted area even for patrols. On the screen, it wasn't a tall monster. It was me. I saw myself in my Border Patrol uniform walking slowly toward the depth of the canyon. My movement was jerky, as if my limbs were strings tied to an unseen hand. The copy on the screen stopped, turned toward the camera, and raised its hand to reveal a face without features. Just absolute whiteness, exactly as I had seen it in the mine. My blood froze. I wasn't in the canyon. I was in the observation tower. Where was the body wearing my uniform? A voice echoed in the room, not from the radio this time, but from behind the locked steel door. Alejandro. It's time for the swap. I didn't need to look through the peephole. I knew from the smell. The scent of ozone and burnt flesh began to fill the room. The entity was no longer hiding in the shadows. It had begun to invade my life from within. I didn't run this time. I pulled my pistol, but my hand wouldn't respond. The entity's long fingers were wrapping around me, not physically, but in my mind, paralyzing my will. I realized the bitter truth at that moment. The Slender Man didn't want to kill me. It wanted to host my life. It had been watching me, studying my moves, mastering the tone of my voice, and now it was ready to take my place among the humans, while I turned into just another memory carved into the walls of the mine. The pistol fell from my hand. The copy approached the door and opened the heavy steel door with supernatural strength. The entity entered, wearing my uniform, carrying my name, and having my face that I knew so well. But in its eyes there was no soul. There was only that endless white void. It spoke to me in my voice, my dialect, my smile. "Thank you, Alejandro. Your shift in the desert has been long and arduous. It's time for you to rest. In the place where you left your memories." My body began to fade. I felt as if I were turning into atoms of black desert sand. I felt no pain, only the cold. That cold that precedes death in the Texas desert. The next morning, Alejandro walked out of the observation tower, smiled at his colleague Sergio, and gave the usual greeting. He walked toward his car, brushed a small white owl feather from his shoulder, and drove off. As for me, I have now become just a grain of dust in Skull Canyon, having neither voice nor body. I watch from afar that entity stealing my life day by day. I see it laughing with colleagues, writing reports, and living its life perfectly normally. But sometimes when it passes a mirror, I see its reflection turn toward me and wink with a hollow white eye. It knows I am here, watching me as I erode in the wind while it plans to add the next victim to its collection. The entity has won. And in the Marfa Desert there is no law, no justice, and no escape. Only sand that waits and a slender man who never tires of waiting for your turn to come.